I'm extremely pleased to bring my next guest to the Crowdsource the Truth audience. It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Cyril Wecht. Dr. Wecht, of course, is a forensic pathologist. He's been a professional witness in some of the most important cases, including, if I'm not mistaken, Doctor, you partook in the 1978 review of the JFK, MLK, and RFK assassinations. Isn't that right?
Yes, JFK and Martin Luther King. I was a member of the forensic pathology panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and I testified giving my minority report, differing from my colleagues, to the full Congressional Committee in 1978.
And Doctor, thank you for doing that. A lot of people don't remember today in 2019 that committee found that there was in fact a conspiracy to murder President Kennedy. So your work, sir, was incredibly important in that case.
Well, thank you very much. And regrettably, despite that finding by a full bipartisan committee of the United States Congress, that has been ignored ever since that time. So another, 22 and 19, 41 years, 4 more decades have passed by. But we can talk about that another time.
Absolutely. I asked you to join us today, Doctor, because there's been so much speculation about these photographs of Jeffrey Epstein that have initially appeared in the New York Post that purport to show him dead on a gurney at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And I know I'm asking you to do something that's outside the normal process. Ordinarily, you would review the body, you'd have extensive photography and access to all kinds of things. We really have this one image only of Mr. Epstein presented to us. What, if anything, can you tell us about this? Do you feel this photograph represents Jeffrey Epstein?
Yes, I did not know him personally. Based upon pictures that I have seen, and looking at this portion of the face from the left side only, I would say that it is certainly compatible with photographs of Mr. Epstein.
Now, a lot of people, Doctor, have said that the ridges and folds in his ear don't match other photographs that people have seen of Jeffrey Epstein. But one thing that I observed in my original examination of these photos was that the people who were making that claim had taken pictures of Jeffrey Epstein in profile from the other side. This picture that the New York Post has presented us shows the left side of Jeffrey Epstein's face, and people were comparing the right side of his face, which they had photographically flipped. Now, I'm not a forensic pathologist. I am a bit of a photo expert, and I would consider that an invalid way to compare the two photos. We need to have a picture of Epstein in profile from the same side, but what I found is there are remarkably few of those images. He's certainly much younger here than he is in the death photo. And the other thing I noticed, Doctor, is that this neck brace seems to be applying some pressure to his ear, which could be distorting the shape and causing people to think it's another person.
Yes, that is correct.
Right.
If this is a matter of determining identification in a forensic scientific fashion, you would have to make anthropometric measurements, and I'm not prepared to do that. I would leave that to a physical anthropologist to make very specific measurements to the millimeter and to correlate one facial structure to another. I can only answer your question that it appears to me to be Jeffrey Epstein, but I can't tell you. If you want to proceed on that basis of surmisal, of reasonable conjecture, fine, but I'm not prepared to tell you that I would testify to that. I would leave that to a forensic photographic expert and a physical forensic anthropologist if that is the issue. I can only talk about what I see, and what I see are some injuries.
Right. And Doctor, one of the things that people who are questioning if this is Jeffrey Epstein have pointed to is the curvature of the nose that we see in the dead subject who is shown in the photograph here. Jeffrey Epstein seemed to have a very straight nose, and this individual seems to have a more curved nose. The nostrils also look slightly different to me. Do you think that anything could occur during the death or after the death of Jeffrey Epstein that might cause the nose to appear this way?
No, it is possible that there could have been some soft tissue swelling, some edema of the tissues associated with facial injuries that could produce a slightly different picture. But again, I must defer to a forensic physical anthropologist if that is the issue. I'm sorry that I cannot express an opinion with reasonable medical or forensic scientific certainty. I don't consider myself to be a photographic expert.
Sure, and I think people appreciate that this is really not necessarily adequate evidence to evaluate this subject, where, you know, these photographs are all sort of taken catch as catch can, pulled off the internet. It's very difficult to say because it does certainly look similar to Mr. Epstein, and when we consider that the misshapen ear that's been presented by people who are doubting if it is Epstein, you know, this really is just not, as you're saying, adequate material to make the judgment. Now, from a procedural standpoint, Doctor, we've seen these photos of what is purported to be the body of Jeffrey Epstein being carried out of New York Presbyterian Hospital. Again, I may be asking you something that you're unable to answer. I know you don't work at New York Presbyterian Hospital. They may have different procedures. I know that you are not a doctor in New York State, so there's a lot of differences. But we've noticed this individual who is pictured wearing body armor and it looks like sort of paramilitary gear. This guy is with the paramedics in the photograph where Mr. Epstein is brought in to the hospital, and he remains with the body as it is taken out of the hospital with these orderlies. It seems odd to me that a person in body armor who, I've never seen a member of the New York Police Department, I've never seen a U.S. Marshal dressed like this. Do you have any idea who this person might be, or what agency he might be with, or what function he might carry out?
No, I do not have any idea with specificity. However, I would comment that it is, as you have said, a quite atypical, if not bizarre, situation. I believe the presence of this somewhat armored, quasi-military type person strongly suggests that if the provenance of the photo can be attested to by someone whose credibility is not in doubt, that this photo, taken in conjunction with the photo that you showed on the screen a moment ago of the side of Mr. Epstein's face, strongly suggests that we are dealing with Mr. Epstein, not Mr. X, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith. I don't see any reason why there would be such an armored guard presence in any kind of a routine death. It's got to be somebody that they are concerned with, and unless something was going on at that time involving somebody else of infamy or prominence or great controversy, I would be very, very doubtful that this is not Mr. Epstein. I think that this kind of confirms, admittedly in a somewhat peripheral fashion, but I think a quite logical, rational way that this is a photo of Mr. Epstein.
Interesting. Now, the last thing I want to ask you about, Doctor, I presume you're familiar with this individual, and it was quite strange to me that he was brought in by the Epstein family, the Epstein legal team. I'm speaking about another forensic pathologist that is Michael Baden. What can you say about this individual?
Michael Baden is a good friend and a respected professional colleague. He's an outstanding forensic pathologist with vast experience. I think the family was very wise. In fact, I suggested that when I was asked by news media before I knew anything about this, that the family would be wise to see if they could have an official observer there. I'm glad that they did, and I am anxiously awaiting the release of the detailed autopsy report to be scrutinized by Dr. Bodden for the family's attorneys representing Epstein's brother, to see if what he saw, what he observed, what he made notes of at the autopsy a couple of Sundays ago or so is truthfully and meaningfully, effectively, honestly set forth in the autopsy report.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting to hear. And do you find it at all unusual, the time that passed for the announcement about the death from the medical examiner here in New York, or was that pretty standard given the circumstances?
I find it very unusual given the fact that the chief medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, issued her official ruling as to the cause and manner of death weeks ago and has not issued the autopsy report. If she had not come out with that conclusion and she had waited, as she should have done, and said that it was pending or undetermined, then I could understand you want to wait for, and she should have done this, official medical, legal, investigative reports from the Attorney General of the United States of America, from the FBI, from the Federal Prison Board, from the Manhattan Correctional Center. What in the world is my understanding that she was not at the autopsy? Not only that she did not do it, but
Whoa.
that's okay. I have no problem if she chose not to do it. That's her decision. And sometimes the chiefs don't want to do the autopsy. But I was amazed to learn that she was not present at the autopsy. And what is even more amazing and really disturbing is that it is my understanding that the case was officially listed as pending as of that Sunday by the pathologist who did the autopsy, and yet the next day Dr. Sampson comes in. Obviously, she didn't have any information from those various governmental agencies that I have listed who were conducting investigative reports, compiling information, interviewing people. She had no information like that at all. How she came out and said that it's a suicide and it's a hanging, I don't think she would have had time to go to the jail, which she would do to visit the scene. Is there any evidence that he hurled himself from the upper bunk? Why were the cameras not working? What about this other cellmate, Tartaglione, who's charged with 4 brutal murders, big, heavy, muscular guy? What about the July 23rd incident in which he was injured? What about all of those things? So I'm amazed. And Dr. Sampson is a very competent, experienced, highly respected forensic pathologist. Don't get me wrong. I'm criticizing what she did. I'm not criticizing her expertise. In fact, viewing and knowing her expertise, that makes it even more puzzling for me as to why she would have released those findings. And now getting back then to your question, why then, having released those findings, are we not getting the autopsy report? Microscopic tissue slides to examine tissues for internal, external injuries, kind of date them, acute, subacute, chronic. That would have been done in a matter of a day or two, just like somebody's gallbladder or appendix is examined at the hospital laboratory. Same thing with tissues removed at autopsy. You give them to the histopathologist, and she makes the slides, and you look at them. Toxicology would have been completed in 24 to 48 hours. They have their own toxicology lab right there. So there's no reason in the world for this autopsy report not to have been released. It is her responsibility, it is her duty, and it is her obligation, which she put on her shoulders herself by issuing that official announcement as to the cause and manner of death. She put the monkey on her back. She has now a duty and a responsibility to get that monkey off her back, so to speak, and issue that autopsy report. I want to see the details. I want to see in writing what they're saying about which structures were fractured, what injuries there were, how old were they, how fresh were they. Those are the things that I want to see.
Interesting. And so, Doctor, you've told us you're aware of Dr. Sampson. Have you ever personally met her or worked with her?
I think I have not worked with her. I think I probably met her at some professional meeting in the past. But no, she's a top flight person, and no question at all about her credentials. She's very well educated. You see, she has a PhD in addition to being a board certified forensic pathologist, and obviously would not have obtained the appointment as the chief medical examiner of New York City if she were not top notch.
Of course. We've heard, this case has had some unprecedented precedents. We've heard from former Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida when Epstein was initially convicted. Mr. Acosta came out and publicly said at his confirmation hearing for the position of Labor Secretary that he was told to back off from Epstein because he was intelligence asset. Would something similar motivate Dr. Sampson to behave in the non-standard ways that you describe? I'm asking you to speculate, but...
Yeah, well, it's pure conjecture. However, you know, I've been involved, JFK and RFK and Martin Luther King,
right,
and so on, and I don't put anything at all past the surreptitious, clandestine reaches and manipulations of governmental agencies, and that relates to major news media too. You deal with JFK, you deal with RFK, and you deal with the hard forensic scientific evidence. Those cases would no more be successful in the courtroom than I would be successful in suing the Pope for murder. So it's a very interesting question that you ask. Why would a highly respected, highly experienced medical examiner who wasn't at the autopsy, what was her rush? What would have been her rush? There's no, you know, on the death certificate of a medical examiner and a coroner, unlike death certificates of doctors in hospitals, there are 5 listings for manner of death: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined. You have to check one of those boxes. To list undetermined or pending, sometimes used in similar fashion, is not rare. In fact, I think the more competent and more experienced and more intellectually comfortable a forensic pathologist is as an ME and so on, is he or she likely to use undetermined? No rush. I want to see things. I want to learn things. When she issued that report, she could not have had all the microscopic tissue slides. She could not have had the toxicology report, and she absolutely did not have investigative reports from the U.S. AG and the FBI, etc., etc. So it does make you wonder. The same thing like with J. Edgar Hoover, within 24 hours telling the world that Lee Harvey Oswald is a soul assassin. Let's just say for a moment, I don't want to digress, but let's just say for a moment to make my point that he truly believed that Oswald was a shooter. How in the world could he, in 24 hours, have come to know that somebody else was involved? How did he know that Cyril Wecht wasn't the driver waiting to take Oswald to the airport? How did he know that Jason Goodman wasn't the pilot waiting to take Lee Harvey Oswald to Mexico? How could he have known that? So when you have these things, and an RFK, an experienced criminal defense attorney, not using a forensic pathologist or a ballistics expert to talk about RFK's wounds and so on. Again, we can talk about those another day. But when you have these things, anybody who is so naive as to believe that the government's hands, their filthy hands, are not on these cases early on, is a simpleton or an incredibly patriotic naive that just believes that the U.S. government would never do these kinds of things. They only do this in Russia and China and some other tyrannical, despotic nations, but never in the United States. Is that right, huh? Yeah. Our CIA and FBI together can make the secret agencies of other countries, except maybe for the Mossad in Israel, look like second raters.
Yeah. Now, doctor, you spoke about the need to release the autopsy. We've heard of other cases where perhaps, maybe not so high profile, but the family objects to the release of an autopsy. What circumstances determine that an autopsy should be public information?
Oh, you're quite right. The report goes to the family. It is private and it is confidential, unless something becomes a formal legal matter and it's introduced into evidence, and then it makes its way out to the public. You're quite right. But it is my understanding, and you can check this for yourself, that report has not been received by Jeffrey Epstein's brother and his attorneys. That is my understanding.
Huh. Very interesting. And just back to Dr. Sampson, so she's the chief medical examiner, and obviously we can presume that there are a number of pathologists who work under her. So many people in New York City, obviously you can't have one person doing all these autopsies. So she's delegating autopsies to other pathologists. And why do you find it strange that she wouldn't be present for, maybe she can't be there for every autopsy?
Well, no, she's not going to be present for every autopsy, and she's not going to do every autopsy, and in fact, she might not do any autopsies. A lot of chiefs stop doing them because they have so many administrative duties. I have no problem with her not having done the autopsy.
Right.
I am amazed, not that she had a formal legal obligation to be present, but I am amazed that she would not have gotten herself into the office to be there, at least for part of the time, with the autopsy of Jeffrey Epstein, given, it was the hottest item
the importance,
in America, in the world at that time. And so unless she had some very serious commitment or something like that, and maybe she did, I don't know. But I'm answering your question. I find it amazing and something that is inexplicable as to her complete absence. And then, as I have said, to repeat for emphasis, her official public statement shortly thereafter, prior to receiving all of the kinds of medical background information she would need, as well as information of an investigative nature from the agencies, including visitation to the cell, detailed photographs, and so on, as well as personal interviews of all the guards. This one was overtired, and this one was overworked, and this one was out to lunch, and this one had not been trained to do this kind of work. This is not some 1-2 cell prison in East Podunksville in rural America.
Right.
This is the federal prison there in New York City that has housed John Gotti, Bernard Sadoff, recently El Chapo. There hasn't been a suicide there in 13 or 15 years, okay? Right. And then you have all of these things, giving him a cellmate, putting him in a room with a double bunk, inviting him to go ahead and commit suicide, having him on the suicide watch, withdrawing suicide watch, putting in a cellmate who's a brutal murderer, a Tartaglione, removing the prisoner the day before Epstein dies. Yeah, there's a picture of Tartaglione. How would you like to be in cell with him? And then you have the July 23rd incident, which I think may have been reflected in the first picture that you showed us, demonstrating a contusion on the face of that individual. If it is Epstein, or whoever it is, there is a contusion. And I thought you were going to ask me about that on the left side of the cheek.
Right here.
That is a contusion. Oh. That is a contusion. And then come in again, and looks to me like there is a little bit of hemorrhage there. We call this the pre-auricular, right in front of the ear. That's the tragus, that little prominence there. And there's definitely a hemorrhagic furrowing right there. So you've got these injuries, and are they fresh? And then you got the neck brace, because they weren't sure whether he was dead or not, or so on. But this is a contusion, and the area in front of the left ear is a hemorrhagic contusion, abrasion. Abrasion is a scratch-like mark. Contusion is a bruise. And we see the bruise of the left cheek, and we see combination of abrasion and contusion in front of the left ear. So these are all part of the picture.
And how do you feel that those injuries play into the hypothesis of hanging versus strangulation, or do they?
You don't get those injuries by a lean into hanging, a la Robin Williams. You know, the prison deaths, and I've done many of these suicides over the years, they tie something to the bedpost and they lean forward. You do not get a bruise on the cheek, and you do not get an injury to the ear by leaning into and hanging yourself. So again, are these fresh? That will you determine microscopically. Maybe they go back to July 23rd when some incident occurred in the jail. And I've never seen an official pronouncement as to whether it was an attempted suicide by Epstein or whether it was an assault by his cellmate. I don't know that. But microscopically, you would be able to differentiate whether it was acute, something that had happened in minutes or an hour or so before his death, as opposed to something that would have happened at that time. It would have been 2-3 weeks before his death.
Right. And we've heard a lot, Doctor, about the damage to the hyoid bone in Jeffrey Epstein's neck. In your experience of examining deaths due to prison hangings, how frequently is the hyoid bone damaged by that?
Rare for a hyoid bone, which, as you can see, depicted as high up in the neck beneath the mandible. It's above the Adam's apple. If you think of a furrow around the neck and so on, and leaning into, then it is understandable that you don't get a fracture of the hyoid bone. Keep in mind, force equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. That's the physics formula that we all know from high school. Okay, what is the mass? The mass here is the head, and not much of a mass. Where's the velocity? There's no velocity. If I lean forward as I'm doing right now, like this, and leaning into a rope to hang myself, there's no velocity. No velocity at all. There's not even, a mile an hour. So where does the force come from? And that's why the hyoid bone is not broken. And you can see way up there under the mandible. Here is the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple. You got a separation on a man his size of more than an inch between the top of the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. Yeah, there you see a depicted hyoid bone up there, and here's the Adam's apple. You see? So you do not see fractures of the hyoid bone in suicidal hangings generally, and more specifically into a leaning into type of hanging with no velocity, no suspension as jumping off from a ladder or hanging out of a window. You do not see a fracture of the hyoid bone. It is rare.
Yeah, it's very interesting to get your input, Doctor, and if I'm understanding you clearly, it seems in your capacity as just a normal U.S. citizen, you've got a lot of questions about all of the circumstances surrounding Epstein's death and the procedures leading up to and afterwards. But in your professional capacity as a forensic pathologist, and given the limited evidence that we have to evaluate, it does seem like this image, at very least, depicts Jeffrey Epstein, and we don't know if he's alive or dead. Can you determine from the photo if this subject is actually dead at this moment?
Oh, no, I could not tell from the photo whether he's dead or not. He could be in a deep state of unconsciousness. No, there's no way to determine life or absence thereof from this photo. No, that I could not do.
Well,
setting aside what I've been told, what I've read,
sure,
being dead, but setting that aside, looking at this picture, I cannot tell you that this is a dead person.
Well, Doctor, I have to thank you for your time. In closing, I'll just ask, have you had an opportunity to speak to Michael Baden since his evaluation of Jeffrey Epstein and his participation in the autopsy?
We've spoken briefly, yes, but Michael, of course, is, under a cloak of confidentiality. He's been retained privately, and I would, not try to intrude upon that because, it would not be a comfortable situation for him. But we've spoken briefly.
Got it. So it's essentially patient-doctor confidentiality, even though in this case the patient is dead. It's an attorney-client privilege type of thing.
He's an attorney, yes, that's right, yeah. He's been retained by attorneys, that's right.
Got it. Well, Dr. Wecht, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. Very valuable input from you, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you. Please let me know how I can gain access to view this myself sometime down the road, okay?
Oh, absolutely. I will send your assistant the link, and I really appreciate your input, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.